Hello, my name's Ali Cameron and I'm here today to talk to you about two great community projects that I've been involved in over the last few years, looking for the Monastery of Deer and at Aden Country Park. Both of the projects are round about the northeast of Scotland and they are to the west of Mintlaw, between Mintlaw and Maud. The first project that I'm going to talk about is the Book of Deer project. Now, the Book of Deer is a pocket gospel dated to around about 850 to 1000 AD, and it has some of the Gospels illustrated, which you can see in the top left here, with the Gospels written out in Latin. But the interesting bit for us is that it has the earliest written Gaelic in the bottoms of the pages. So you can see on the right here at the bottom of the page, in this Gaelic, there are land transactions written out, including various places named around the northeast of Scotland. And there's also a foundation legend of the foundation of a monastery. We went down to see the book last year in 2019 in Cambridge, and a really interesting talk that they gave to the group. And they have some ideas about this foundation legend, which they think may have been put specifically into this book because it was the oldest book within the monastery at that time, therefore giving this foundation legend more gravitas. But we wonder then if it's possible that you need to be more cautious when you're reading this foundation legend. But essentially it was set up, it talks about the setup of the monastery, and we don't know where that monastery was. There's been quite a bit written about the book itself and about the monastery, and there's this great book on the studies of Book of Deer, which has a lot of information about that we're using in our project to try to work out where the monastery was. The lands of Deer Abbey were substantial, so you can see here quite a huge area, and you can see Old Deer Parish Church in just at the very east edge of the estate, than Deer Abbey itself here. So again, we're using these place names and lands to look and see where this monastery was. We know the monastery, there would have been a monastery because Deer Abbey wasn't started until 1219, but we're looking for somewhere founded around 800 or 900 AD. We don't really know much about it. We don't know what it was made from. Was it wood, in which case it might be incredibly difficult to find. Would it have been stone? How many buildings there were? How many monks? And of course where it was located. And if we knew the answer to one or two of those, that would help us. We've been looking at other monasteries of a similar period, so places like Inchmarna, and looking at the types of buildings that they had there, and at Port Mahomack as well, so the size and shape of the buildings that we might be expecting. We'd obviously be expecting a church, graveyard, accessory buildings, so smithies and various other workshops. We'd also be looking for certain finds, so we might be looking for finds that are associated with vellum manufacture here, and here are the ones from Port Mahomack, which are a fantastic little selection of finds. And also to do with metalworking, so we'd be looking for crucibles, molds, and whetstones, and other buildings like this, which would have industrial debitage, so industrial waste like slag. We might also be looking for cross stones, cross slabs. So here are the ones from Tulloch, which are a lovely little selection of stones here. But also possibly a ditch, so round about the church, the monastery, there may have been a ditch which would have surrounded. And this is the one at Tulloch, which was excavated by the Murrays a few years ago. And other objects, so when we were excavating this site, every bit of slate we were analysing and studying and looking at under different lights to see if we could see scratches or marks. This is this fantastic slate at Inchmarnock, which depicts maybe slave raiding or hostage taking. Is one of the figures a monk with a reliquary? We're not sure, but these are the sorts of things that we would be looking for. The Book of Deer project have been looking since 2009 for the monastery and doing excavations around about Deer Abbey and Old Deer. One of the sites that they looked at was a possible late prehistoric site within Aden Country Park. So there is an overlap of these two projects a little bit. They're very close together. But these were found actually not to be late prehistoric, but probably remains of military training camp, and I'll talk a little bit more about these later. The Murrays and myself have spent quite a lot of time digging test pits within Old Deer itself. So you can see test pits all around the village, in open areas, in people's gardens, in the churchyard here. So this is the medieval church, the late 18th century church, and we've excavated quite a number of trenches now. We took advice from Richard Fawcett, who came up and did a report on the church, on the medieval church, and he gave a talk and took us round. And he doesn't think there's anything earlier really there than the 12th century, so nothing early medieval built into that church. This is the church, so you can see on the right here, you've got the medieval church and the later church here. You can see Pont here, which shows Deer in this crook of the river. Now, quite a number of the people in the project thought that this was a very significant location and probably the one for the monastery. So we did some investigation here, and first of all, we did quite a large geophysical survey. This was Rose Geophysics who did this for us. And we got rather excited when we got the results back, because you can see the medieval church here in the grey, and just to the northeast of it, you can see in red what looks like a structure here, and obviously a number of other anomalies here. We looked at the layer plan here. This is upside down so that I can show you the same way as the geophysics, but this is the 1870 layer plan, and again we've just put the outline of that red onto here, and you can see that there's a lot of older graves here, which we obviously didn't want to disturb, but we managed to find a number of places where we could excavate trenches, and we found first of all that when the 1780 church was built, a lot of soil was laid down on the graveyard, so we were digging down a metre, a bit more, and finding remains still quite recent in the sort of 1800s. We did find a number of places to excavate around about that anomaly, and we went down between the more recent graves. Now, this anomaly was supposed to be very shallow, which made us very suspicious of it, but in fact it turned out to be a layer of mortar which was hard here, with graves cut between it, and that was leaving a signal which allowed us to think it was in the shape of a structure. But unfortunately, below that was fairly modern grave soil, burial soil, and so that whole anomaly is built up of later activity in the churchyard. We did find a huge amount of evidence of the rebuilding and reworking of the church. It's been changed at various times, and so we found plaster and gravestones, bits of gravestones and bits of decorative ironwork, and a lovely little, in the bottom right, this little slate disc, which may be almost any period and could be early medieval in date. In one trench, we managed to get down between graves and found the wall of the medieval church, which had been demolished to allow the later 18th century church to be built. So we were able to get quite far down, including down to the natural subsoil in that location. And we still weren't really finding anything early medieval in date. We also went into people's gardens, and this was a fantastic bit of the project where we knocked on people's good doors, and the family on the left, we actually knocked on the door, and the girl in the middle came to the door and said, "Well, you're the archaeology wifey." And she had been with her school to our project and recognised us. And of course, then it was absolutely essential. We had to dig a trench in their garden. And it was great fun. We spent a couple of days working with families, and they really enjoyed it. Very, very little early in date, mostly 18th century and later. And so that tallied with all the other test pits that we excavated within the village. makes me think this is unlikely to be the location of the monastery and just not finding the early medieval finds. But we can't completely discount it. It's more just that we've dug in everybody's garden who will allow us, and we've dug a lot in the church, and it's very tricky digging in between the graves. So in 2017, I suggested to the project that we look in the area around Deer Abbey itself. So you can see there in the centre Deer Abbey, which is a scheduled monument, and the fields surrounding it. They seem to me to be a very interesting area. That there's a flat plateau here which then goes down to the South Ugi water there, and just seemed to be a possible really good location for a monastery. We know that this has been a Cistercian monastery and that they usually do build on greenfield sites. But we know at Kouros, for example, that they built on the same site. And so we thought it was worth at least getting geophysical survey done. There would be some areas which would be really difficult. So in the scheduled area, we know that the abbey itself, the later abbey, has been reworked by General Ferguson and various other people to tidy it up, and we think even some of the wall lines are being realigned slightly because they don't seem to line up on the ground. But we got scheduled monument consent to do resistivity within the scheduled area and in the area out with. And so this is the resistivity survey. So again, you can see the scheduled area in the centre and some interesting anomalies coming up. The lines here, which are in dark, are the early 19th century paths, which were from the Ferguson of Pitford. This was being essentially his garden, his walled garden, and the paths are from that era. But within the path alignments, you can see that there's some interesting anomalies that we wanted to investigate. So in 2017, we got a team together to do an excavation in the summer. We were really lucky that just before the dig, BBC Alba asked us if we would film the excavation, and so Midas Media, Pat, Dad and Scott came and filmed us for the whole 2 weeks, and so we've got a really good record of this excavation. We dug several trenches over the area, and not all as successful, some as successful as others. This was a trench that we excavated to the west of the area where there seemed to be an anomaly. And there was areas of stones which seemed to be more like paths. They had very few foundations. And when we dug down and underneath them, we actually found 19th century plant pots mixed in the soil. But we also found medieval stone. So we've got medieval stonework, and we also found human bones mixed in amongst those. So when we had discovered the dating evidence for this, we obviously did all the recording and then closed this trench off. But while we were being filmed, because we'd found human remains, we had to phone the police, which was obviously a great plot point for this programme that we were making. And this was actually a picture that I didn't know was being taken, but by the film crew. And they asked the police if it was okay if it was all filmed, and they agreed that it was. And so the policeman came down, and as is normal on a site where we find human remains, they asked me questions, name, age, date of birth, place of birth, and all of the usual things when you're giving a statement, and then obviously to explain what the human bones were. When I'd done that, they were happy that we continued, and in fact in this case we put the bones back just into the trench, covered them up again, but they were probably from the clear out of Deer Abbey by General Ferguson in the early 19th century, and he dumped human bone and building materials into the area at the west of the site. But a couple of the trenches were much more successful. So this is one where in that first year, so this is the first of 2 years that we excavated, we were only digging by hand, and this trench was more than 0.5 metre of soil above these features. And so by the time we got down to there, it was really late in the dig. But we had some stonework here, which you could clearly see, and we had some post holes. We half excavated one here, and you can see more post holes here, which we went on to excavate in the following year, which I'll tell you about in a minute. This was really interesting because we were finding a lot of handmade pottery at the beginning of the, in the soil above these features. And at first we wondered if it might be prehistoric. But eventually, after studying it and then getting radiocarbon date of the charcoal on these cooking pots, they were actually handmade cooking pots from the medieval period, so from the late 13th to late 14th century. But really interesting, the link possibly to Rattray, which had medieval pottery kilns at this period. Maybe they were made there, but for the abbey rather than the monastery. We had another trench in 2017. Again, it was really deep, more than 60 centimetres deep. But when we got to the bottom of it, we found this lovely stone hearth with this shallow ditch around the edge of it. So the stone hearth was full of charcoal, and eventually we got samples and we got them dated. And this was really exciting because we were able to premiere this on the programme, which went out on the BBC, that we just got the dates in, and they come in at 1147 to 1260 AD. So the potential there that they are early medieval in date, and that they predate Deer Abbey, which started in 1219. There was also bits of slag within the soil above the hearth, suggesting that we may be in a workshop area. And this ditch around the outside here, on the north edge, so very shallow, but with stake holes in the bottom. You can see the stake holes here on the right. And this suggests that it was maybe a windbreak or maybe a post and wattle structure around the hearth, maybe to protect from prevailing winds from the north. And Jan Dunbar did a really nice reconstruction drawing of what this maybe looked like. So with a post and wattle screen here on the top right, we had some posts suggesting that there was a little screen in the middle, maybe even more temporary, maybe just with leather, and obviously the hearth structure here being used with bellows, possibly, as I said, in an industrial area. And so we went back in 2018, and the most sensible thing we did was to get a machine in to start the trenches. This was really difficult because the gate is very narrow, and so we had to source a machine which allowed us to, we could get in. But we had planned a big excavation, so lots of volunteers, Young Archaeologists Club, 13 primary and secondary school classes, and so a huge team. And we opened up a number of other trenches as well, which I'm going to show you. In the trench which had the stone and the post holes in 2017, we eventually, within an area about 7 by 7 metres, had at least 4 structures. And this included a sort of later wall, a medieval stone wall foundation. We've got a couple of structures here with the post holes here, and a couple of post holes here which maybe were a different structure. We've also got stake hole structures. So these are all stake holes where a stake has been pressed into the ground, and when the wood rots, it just leaves a little circle with little wood remains in it. This is an image from above. You can see the wall. The stone that we found in the previous year turned out actually to be demolition rubble, and we tried to make that into other things, whether it was a courtyard, but it seemed to be too rough and really not enough structure in it to be anything. And one of the post holes that we excavated, we had really good dating evidence from that, and that dates to 669 to 777 AD. So definitely an early medieval structure here. Some of the post holes don't have much dating evidence from them, and some of them we haven't had dated yet. So we're thinking buildings over a period of at least the 7th century through to at least the 12th or 13th century within this trench. Here you can see the stake hole structures. They're very difficult. With the volunteers, it was really difficult to make sure that they were all actually a stake hole, because it's very difficult if there's a little stone to see. But the ones that we've planned on in here in the bottom right were all definitely stake holes that had wood or an organic fill to them. And we excavated test pits over other areas of the field. So this was sort of 1 by 1 next to the main trench. But again, lots and lots of stake holes, and they seem to be in pairs. You can see that there's 2 together. So whether that's a structure which involved 2 posts together, or whether it was actually a replacement, we're not sure. but what we do know is that it was next to one of the water courses. So this is actually where there's been water flowing through the site, and we wondered if it's something to do with water management or to do with fishing possibly. And we have to do a bit more on this. These little trenches are great for working out if there is something, but obviously then interpreting it within little trenches is much more difficult. And we did have some bigger post holes, and these looked as though they might be later, but virtually no dating material within them, just a sort of sandy fill, and possibly suggesting that posts had been pulled out at some point. But again, we need to do a bigger uncovering of these. And so altogether we had 3 structures of stake holes, 2 structures of post holes, 1 of stone. And here you can see one of the water courses, and you've got these stake holes at the bottom here. So we've got dating from one of the stake holes, from wood from one of the stake holes, and it came out again in the early medieval period, so prior to the abbey being built, 1030 to 1155 AD. And I mentioned water courses, and there were several running through the site. So it appeared that the South Uton water had been canalised or taken in through water courses through the site and then back out again into the river. And so we were concentrating on areas round about these, which seemed to be where a lot of the stake holes were. And we think this is a purposeful water management to buildings that presumably needed water. So whatever they were doing here, they needed a lot of water for it. In the 2018 excavation, we also were filmed, but by a team from Nescol, North East Scotland College, and they came in, and they had a director, Jack, and cameraman and sound, and interviewed all of us and made up a film about that excavation. This is Premila, who was one of our volunteers, and she and a team uncovered this fantastic path, stone path, which you can see on the left. It relates to the hearth, we think, that you can see the hearth from the previous year, and these are in relation. So we put this trench right next to the hearth trench, and you can see that path there, and then one of these water courses. So this was a path probably laid in a watery area next to the water courses, and we had charcoal from the bedding layer of that path, which were dated 1041 to 1211, so again in this early medieval period. So building up quite a picture of a big number of structures relating to this early medieval period. Within the soil, above the stake hole buildings, we found this fantastic find. The assistant director, Jan Dunbar, actually found it, and she came up to me. We were all matticking and shoveling, and she came up to me with her hand behind her back. And when she does that, I know that it's something really exciting. She's done this to me before. And she handed over this, and she handed it over to me like that. And she knew what it was. I knew what it was. And you can see that there's a gaming board being marked on it. So squares of a gaming board. There's also a symbol here, which I'll tell you about in a second. And then the board has been chipped into a circle, and we would call that a pot lid. So a lid to go onto a medieval pot when it's being boiled on a stove. And these are, they could be early medieval or high medieval in date. And they're associated with games like chess, one of them being Nefertafel. And this is when we were doing the excavation. Some of the volunteers decided they were going to play it, and Jan made us this board that they were playing with, and we collected little round stones, water wash pebbles that we were able to play it with, and they got the instructions for the game. And this is a couple of them playing. The university students, this is Jacob and Daniele, who have just graduated from Aberdeen University, 2 of the great volunteers that we have on these projects. And I mentioned the symbol on the other side. So on the other side of the board is the Solomon's knot, which was adopted as a religious symbol. It's seen as a sort of a non-ending swirl, and there's some fantastic stories about these, that they were put on to things like roof tiles, because the devil would get lost in the actual structure. He'd go in and get lost in the structure, and so they were a good luck symbol. We don't know the origin of this stone, but the gaming board specialist Mark Hall thinks that it's possible that this was part of the roof slate, and then a board scratched on it and the solemn's not. And we got incredible publicity with this, the Smithsonian, the Times, Current Archaeology, and we did lots of interviews about it. They obviously latch on to that it was associated with this early medieval building, and lots about the games themselves and what the site would have been. Unfortunately, we can't actually say that this is definitely the monastery at the moment, but that we have buildings now that we want to uncover. It was mentioned in various articles, and one thing, our problem that the project has is that how do we then capitalise on that? That we have this great publicity, but we want to keep the project going. Other finds, we had associated with it, we had some other pieces of gaming boards and other bits of pottery. So we had a bit of a urinal, which was fantastic, and again, that was we found that when one of the groups of children were with us, and it was a fantastic bit of history of the site. It's a much later, it's 13th or 14th century, so associated with the monastery. And we had lots of children and families come to the site, and we did pottery and various activities with them. We found a lot of stone, so we know a bit more about the abbey itself. We know the stone structure, some of the features of it. And we have quite a number of other finds from the site. We've got flint, and we've got much more recent finds. So we had lots of really, really good finds to show people on open days. This is a picture of the team. Obviously, we'll be doing our publicity here. We've got our heritage lottery and marquee hire people who lent us the marquee. And now what we want to do is to build on that fantastic project, and we want to raise money to do a larger excavation, maybe in 2022, possibly looking at heritage lottery again. And that's what we're working on at the moment with this project, to uncover these structures, find out more about them, do more dating, and see if we can find out if this is the monastery or if it's another large early medieval Pictish structure. So now I'm going to move on to Aden, and it is linked, as I said, to the Book of Deer. It's an estate adjacent to Deer and is mentioned in the book itself. It's an Aberdeenshire Council park, and you can see here it's got a number of facilities, museum, coffee shop, lots of farming museum. The estate on the first edition Ordnance Survey was heavily covered with trees, with a house and a farm centre. I've called the talk 8,000 years. One of the finds that we have, this lovely little Mesolithic core, which we found as part of the project. And so we know that the people lived around the estate or around this area for at least 8,000 years. The project had various different strands to it. So when we went and started the project, we didn't really know how many sites there were in the park and what sort of sites. And part of that was fun for the volunteers to do walkovers and field walking and various other activities. One thing that was brought to our attention was on the left here, this huge, great big stone, which is lying in a ditch with a tree growing over it. This is Neil Ackerman, who was with Aberdeenshire Council, and he and I and a few other people went and studied it, and we sent pictures to Adam Welfare to see if he thought it might be a recumbent from a stone circle. And it does appear that it's the right size and shape, but there are an awful lot of very, very large boulders in the park. And you can see one here. We've dug little test pits around these, and most of these are sitting on the surface within the soil. And it's just a very, very stony area. So although there was rumour that there'd been a stone circle in the park somewhere that had been removed, we have not yet found any evidence of it. One of the things that we did was we field walked over some of the fields that had been ploughed, and we also did geophysics. We've put in a lot of trenches and found a number of things. One of the things that was brought to our attention was this huge, great big earth-fast stone in the corner of one of the fields, and on it there appears to be a cut mark, and it seems to be, there's been various people attacking this stone in the past. They've tried to remove it, but that actually does appear to be a genuine cut mark on the top of it. So we did a number of trenches in the first year, 2017, and we found some post holes which were very, very poorly preserved. These fields have been heavily ploughed, including tractor competitions which have ploughed very, very deeply, and associated with lots of flints of early to late Neolithic date. We had lots of kids out on these projects. We had them uncovering more of the stone to see if we could find any more cut marks, and obviously helping us to do our digging as well. And eventually, after a project in 2017 and 2018, the 3 post holes that we initially found in the first trench, we've expanded the trench, and we've eventually found we've got a rectangular or sub-rectangular structure with the definite post hole bases in black here, other posts and other pits in purple, which some of which may be agricultural, removing stone holes. We've got where trees have been, so tree throws, tree bowls, here in the green, and then in the red we've got quarrying. So somebody's come in and later than the structure have quarried out materials and then backfilled the pits. So we took several teams of archaeologists, volunteers, and we half excavated each of the features that we could find, then discounting some as being natural and some are definitely, this charcoal filled pit here, definitely the base of the post hole. Some of them were much more enigmatic. So on the left we've got these huge earth-fast stones which appear, the one on the left here, to have been cut round at one time. And that maybe not in the Neolithic, but maybe more to do with removing big stones for farming purposes. On the right here, really no charcoal in this fill, but does seem to have a cut around it. So some of the features were really tricky to actually interpret. Again, Jan Dunbar does an illustration of what this might have been like. So we've got some posts which were standing. We don't have posts in the centre of the structure which would be large enough to hold a roof, so we don't think it was a roofed structure. And we don't think the posts were very big because they're not substantial post holes. We've got some small posts around in a sort of sub-rectangular area, and we've also got some living trees. So within the structure we think that there were living trees which had then fallen as part of the decay of the structure. This is it set out in a Neolithic date, possibly being used with an excarnation platform here for birds and foxes to remove the flesh from dead bodies. We haven't actually got absolute dating for this yet because the charcoal that we found within the structure, within the post hole so far, has not been readily datable. But we're just waiting for lockdown to finish to send samples off to get the next lot of samples from the last dig, which look much, much more promising to be able to get a date. So I shall let you know when I have those dates. One of the other structures that we found was found by a couple of our volunteers and their dog, Morlich. They were wandering through the woods and found a sort of T-shaped structure. It was all overgrown in the first season, but we've done 3 small excavations at the site, and we eventually uncovered this wonderful T-shaped structure. You can see this all built in one phase. One of the important things for us to find out, and this to find out what date it is, was whether it was all built in one phase, and we found out that it was. The northern half of the building is made up of large stones. There's a door in the north here, and the southern half of the structure here along this wall is made up of much smaller stones, but there's a door in the west, a door in the east, and 2 in the south wall. This is it looking in from the east end through the door, with all our archaeologists uncovering. The area was covered by trees, and so there's a lot of disturbance. The soil within the centre here is covered in full of roots and burrows, and so it was very difficult inside the building to work out floor levels. But you can see here one of the doors with the threshold on the left, with some cobbles outside and inside. And another one on the doors, this is a fantastic door in the south, which had these enormous, great big stones, which were being used for jambs. And I think it's likely that this is the outside on the left of the stone. These would have been visible in the wall. That they were, it was like a feature within the structure. And we were wondering if this is maybe the earliest door which was built in the original structure, and maybe the other doors were later. We're not sure why we needed 5 doors. There are a few theories, but that's a difficult one. And some of the wall was really well built. You can see here, medium boulders with this cherry cocking in between, but not substantial walls, 80 centimetres thick, but not made of enormous stones. So probably thinking that it was maybe just a 1-story building. You can see here the corners and the way that the building's constructed. And in the bottom, we actually found some sort of clay wall treatment, so like a plaster that had been put onto the inside of the walls, which maybe was, it could have been painted or, but it's very, very difficult. It's very, very fragmentary remains survive. And we found quite a number of coins within the demolition material, mostly 17th century in date, Turners, James I and James II. And we found this lovely brooch. This is both sides of this lovely little lock and booth type brooch, copper alloy. And we found parts of 3 sets of spectacles, copper alloy rims, glass lenses, and probably dating to maybe again the sort of 16th, 17th century. And a lot of window glass. This has all been looked at by Helen Spencer, and she's done X-ray fluorescence on those. And there are 2 phases of glass. One is from the late 16th and early 17th century, and one from the sort of late 17th century. And we don't know whether this was reused glass or whether there actually was an initial phase of glazing and then replacement. And we had quite a lot of burnt wood from the north, just inside the north door, Scots pine planking, probably burnt when the building was burnt. We think it was burnt down. And the dates for those around sort of early 18th century to early 19th century in date. There was another building associated with the T-shaped building, a rectangular building, much more of a domestic style building with a cobbled hearth at one end, one wall dividing, so at least 2 rooms, and a circular pit at one end. There were large trees over this structure, and so some of the areas which are dotted in we couldn't get to because of the trees, which have since been removed, so we're hoping to go back and do a bit more at this site. You can see here the hearth there, the hearth end, looking into the hearth and the cobbles. Here the dividing wall and the circular pit here. Again, virtually no dating for this structure, very, very disturbed, and so very, very little in relation to finds altogether. And so when we're looking at these buildings, it's quite difficult to know what they are. They're not on the first edition Ordnance Survey. They're not on really any maps. Liz Curtis got in touch with me, not the archaeologist Liz Curtis, but she's doing research into the Keith family who owned the Aden estate, and she'd found these charters suggesting that there was a lost fortified house within the estate somewhere, and so we'd wondered if that was a possibility that we'd actually found this estate house. But it doesn't seem to quite fit. There's 5 entrances. We don't really know exactly when it was built. We've obviously got the glazing, which suggests it was built around the middle of the 16th century, being used in the 17th century, and then burnt down maybe in the middle of the 18th century. There's a story about an Episcopalian meeting house, which was in the area somewhere, and we're wondering actually if this is a post-Reformation chapel that probably 1 story, and that would fit with there being no domestic pottery, no animal bone, roofing material. We found spectacles, coins, and window glass, which again suggests possibly a chapel. And no internal partitions were visible, which again it makes it really difficult to interpret the building unless it's a single story open structure. When we started considering this, we worked out that it could probably sit 100 people, so this is a big building. And of course the floors and roofs and walls have all been removed for reuse, so it's made it quite difficult to interpret. But a fantastic site to uncover, really having nobody really knowing about it before. And so yes, probably a post-Reformation chapel. The Keith family were Episcopalians, and maybe built for them and the local people to worship. We went and had a look at some other sites as well. The Aden Mansion House, which is now a ruin, was quite a splendid house. It was built by the Russell family when they bought the estate in the 18th century and converted, and there's a lot of reuse of stone and rebuilding. So we were trying to work out what was original. Was there more than one phase? There's this stone here, Alexander Russell and Eliza Innes, and a 1773 date stone here at the bottom. So we had some images that we went, this is a really puzzling one. I was showing this to all the kids, and this is supposed to be Aden, but we're not sure this is our Aden. It doesn't look anything like the building that we know is there, and and there's this odd sort of goat and people all dressed up, and we're not sure that this is our actual Aden. So what we did was we did a geophysical survey again, rose geophysics, and we found some really nice, interesting targets around the garden area on the left to investigate. This is a great drone picture we took during the excavation. You can see the ruin quite clearly. So what we did was put trenches all over the ruin around the garden area to see if we could work out how many phases the building had been built in, and what was whether there was anything earlier. This bit of wall came up on the west and under the west wall. So we're digging down, this is the west wall at the top. And there's another piece of wall here underneath, which is at a different angle. And we think that it's likely that this is an earlier phase of the house. Whether this is the early Russell phase and then it was rebuilt, we're not absolutely certain. And we can't really get into it to investigate any further. And inside, huge amounts of soil are being put into the interior of it to make it safe. So at the moment, we're just leaving that as a possible earlier structure. We thought we had walls running through the garden, but they turned out to be this amazing 1 metre deep drain, stone-lined and stone-topped drain. And this was our archaeologists investigating it, Betty and Sarah here in the middle, who put on the hard hat and went just down into it slightly with torches to see. And we got a local contractor to come in with drain rods with a camera and have a look underneath it. Unfortunately, it was blocked in both directions, but it's obviously been part of the water management of the estate. And the estate manager now, he actually knew that there was something under the ground because he could see where it comes out at the river. But it was really interesting that we could track these different drains across the site. We also found a bit of the pond. This is a fantastic concrete pond base, enormous thing, which would have been in the centre of the garden here on the first edition. And we just uncovered that and recorded it and backfilled it. It was an enormous pit filled with thrown away bits of pottery. This is on the left. We found hundreds of bits of this fire clay pottery, which is from the south of Scotland. There's a fantastic image here, which was when the council took over Aden. They photographed every room, and within one of the rooms within the house, there were all these fire clay. So some of them are from garden furniture like these in the bottom left, and some of them are from the pediment that ran along the top of the house here. And so we found lots and lots of pieces of those. One stamped Garnkirk. And one other site that we looked at were, I mentioned circular structures which maybe were Bronze Age right at the beginning. But we investigated another area just to the north of the estate next to the campsite where there were lots and lots of lumps and bumps had been recorded on this orienteering map drawn many, many years ago. And this was the Murray's work in 2011. They looked at one area and found virtually no finds. There were a few flints and a couple of buttons, but really nothing dating these structures. But we went and we did a plane table survey of a huge woodland area. And I was really shocked when we finished this and put it all together. And we have these fantastic arrangement of different shaped structures. So these are banks and ditches, all through this woodland. And when we looked at them individually, we were able to see that the banks had been created by upcast from the ditches. Some of them had several ditches, so you can see the bank here and the ditches running off a roundabout. And again, you can see here the ditches, some of them quite deep in date. Some of them are, I think, late 19th century. There was a tree on this one which we reckoned was about 120 years old. And so we could sort of date some of these roughly by the trees on them. And this is that one, so you've got the big tree on the bank here, and you can see the banks and ditches going down here. And this just to show you how the banks were made up. So you can see they've dug down and then they upcast clay and stones to make the banks of the ditches. And very, very few finds. In the soils below, we found 19th century pottery. So we knew that the banks and ditches weren't older than the 19th century. We found lots of buttons. So these are like fly buttons from military uniforms. We found palmolive shaving cream and a number of bottles, most of which weren't very easily datable. But we think that it's a military training camp. And there's in the Peterhead Sentinel, the Buchan Journal, we've looked through some of the old newspapers. This is from 1889, and there's quite a lot of references to Buchan Rifle Camp at Aden. And the local estates would set up camps to train young volunteers who would be going away to war. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, General Frank Russell, who was the Laird of Aden, he's known to have allowed these camps to be set up within Aden. And so we think we found this really extensive military camp over possibly a period of maybe 50, 60 years in the late 19th and early 20th century. And just a sort of small addendum to that, there was these stone structures which had come up on the south side of the park. One of the volunteers had noticed them, and when I initially went, it was really difficult to say whether they were anything. But once we'd excavated down, there's definitely stone structures. You can see that there's a shallow pit with stones around, and here's some other structures and banks and ditches here. And again, you can see it was very difficult, before we'd taken the soil out. But once we got the soil out, we could see that there were structures. And whether these are also military structures or something to do with grouse shooting, something to do with the estate, we're not sure. But there are structures all over the estate which we've started investigating. One of the things that the Book of Deer project and Aden do really, really well is their education projects. We get school kids in every day. We have classes. Generally, they're the primary classes, sometimes the Law Academy, and we show them around the site and we let them do excavation. So they definitely get their hands dirty and they love it. They don't want to go home once they've started digging. And we get them to do some drawing as well. So some of them are really keen on art and drawing. So we show them how to do some planning and finds drawing. And of course, we make them do paperwork as well. We make them draw finds, and they really enjoy getting their hands dirty. And one of the things that these projects could not be carried out without are the volunteers. And so these are some of the pictures of the amazing volunteers that we've had on the projects. Far too many to count, and we want to thank them all.